The headstone read my name, full legal name, date of birth correct down to the year, date of death listed as March 14th, 43 days after the outbreak began. Someone had carved it into limestone, not scratched, carved, with patience and a chisel, and what I can only describe as love. There were flowers at the base. Dead now, but they'd been real once. Wild flowers. The kind my mother used to pick from the ditch beside Route 11 and put in a jar on the kitchen table every Sunday from April through October. I stood there on day 97 with a gravel rash on both palms and a left boot held together with electrical tape. And I read my own name on a grave in the town I grew up in the cemetery behind the church where I was baptized, 3 rows from my father's actual grave. And I understood something that took the ground out from under me more completely than any dead thing with broken teeth ever had. They thought I was gone. They'd grieved me. They'd finished. My name is Elliot Brosk. I am 36 years old. I was a land surveyor for the county assessor's office in Marwell, Virginia. Population 4,200 before the collapse. And I'm telling you this not because I survived 100 days alone in a world that came apart at the seams, but because on the 97th day I found evidence that my death was the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. More meaningful than anything I did while breathing, more useful, more loved. I need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the outbreak. You already know that story. Everyone who's still alive knows some version of that story. But the beginning of mine. Because my 100 days didn't start when the infected showed up. They started 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday in September, when I drove away from Marwell in a truck I didn't own, with $11,000 I'd taken from my mother's savings account and a note on the kitchen counter that said I'd pay it back. I didn't pay it back. I drove to Roanoke, rented a room above a laundromat, worked cash jobs, drank, told myself I'd left because Marwell was suffocating me, because the job was killing me, because my mother's disappointment was a frequency only I could hear, and it never stopped broadcasting. All of that was true, and none of it was the reason. The reason was that I'd been sleeping with my best friend's wife for 4 months, and he found out on a Monday, and by Tuesday, the town knew. And by Wednesday, I couldn't buy gas at the Citgo without someone looking at me like I'd skinned a dog in public. So I left. Not with dignity, not with a plan. I left the way a fire leaves a building fast, ugly, and leaving the structure worse than I found it. Nate Bowling was the friend. We'd known each other since 1st grade. He coached Little League. He let me borrow his truck every spring when I needed to haul survey stakes. He brought soup to my mother after her hip surgery and sat on the porch with her for 2 hours talking about nothing because he knew she was lonely. And I hadn't come home in 3 weeks. He was a better man than me in every category, except the one where his wife told me she was miserable, and I decided that her misery was my invitation. Dana. That was her name. I'm not going to spend time on what happened between us, because it doesn't matter to this story the way you'd think. What matters is that when I left Marwell, I left behind a broken marriage I caused, a best friend I gutted, a mother I robbed, and a town that watched me do all of it in sequence and remembered. 6 months later, the world ended, and I survived it. 100 days alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Shenandoah Valley, eating out of gas stations and sleeping in deer blinds. Not because I was tough or prepared or brave, but because I had no one to go back to. No one waiting, no one expecting. I survived because I was already gone, and the dead don't look for ghosts. Then I came home, and I found the grave. I should tell you about the first time I saw one. An infected. Day 1, technically. though I didn't know it was day 1 yet. I was in the Roanoke room, October 19th. I'd been awake since 4 in the morning because the couple downstairs had been screaming at each other and then abruptly stopped, which was somehow worse. I was sitting on the edge of the mattress drinking instant coffee that tasted like hot rust when I heard a sound from the alley. Not screaming, not a car. Something between choking and clicking. A rhythmic, wet noise that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I looked out the window. A man was standing below in the alley beside the dumpster, facing the brick wall. He was wearing a hospital gown. His feet were bare, and one of them was turned at an angle that meant the ankle was finished. He was hitting his forehead against the wall. Not hard, repeatedly. Tap, tap, tap. Like he was trying to remember something, and the wall might give it back. I watched him for 4 minutes. Then he turned around, and I saw his face, and I closed the curtain and sat back on the bed and didn't move for an hour. I won't describe what I saw because you've seen it too by now, or seen enough of what comes after. What I will tell you is that I didn't call anyone, didn't call 911, didn't go downstairs, didn't check on the couple who'd stopped screaming. I sat on a mattress in a room I rented with stolen money, and I decided it wasn't my problem. That's who I was on day 1, the man who saw it first and did nothing. By day 3, Roanoke was coming apart. The news was still calling it a neurological event, a localized contamination, something about a water treatment failure, and everyone was still performing the rituals of normalcy. Locking doors, driving to work, calling insurance companies. But the math was already visible if you watched. The clinics were overflowing. The police stopped responding after midnight. There was a fire on Campbell Avenue that burned for 9 hours because no truck came. I packed the truck on the night of day 3. Not much to pack. 2 changes of clothes, a pocket knife, a case of water bottles from the gas station, a box of granola bars, and a road atlas I'd bought at a thrift store 2 months earlier because I liked looking at the topographic lines. That atlas saved my life more times than any weapon I ever held. I drove south, then west, then south again. No destination, no plan, away. That was the whole strategy, away from the density, away from the highways, away from anywhere people congregated. Because by day 5, I'd figured out what took the news until day 9 to say out loud. The infected weren't random. They followed sound. They followed crowds. They went where the living were thickest, and the living kept gathering in parking lots and school gymnasiums and church basements, because that's what people do when they're afraid. They moved toward each other. I moved the other direction, not out of strategy, out of practice. I'd been moving away from people for 6 months. The outbreak didn't change my behavior. It justified it. By day 8, I was in the George Washington National Forest, parked on a fire road 17 miles from the nearest town, eating cold beans from a can with a plastic fork. No phone signal, no radio, no contact with anyone. I could hear birds. I could hear the creek below the ridge where I'd parked. I could hear wind through the sourwood trees. I couldn't hear anyone dying. That was the whole point. I set up a pattern. Wake before dawn. Move the truck to a new position. Walk a perimeter. Identify water. Identify sight lines. Eat once in the morning, once at dusk. Never cook. Smoke carries. Never use a flashlight after dark. Never stay in the same spot more than 36 hours. The atlas had Forest Service roads marked in dotted green lines, and I followed them like veins, moving through the mountains without ever touching a highway. I saw infected twice in the first 2 weeks, both times at distance, both times alone. Singles, not groups. I learned they moved downhill. They moved toward water. They moved toward sound. If you were quiet and high, they passed below you like water running to a drain. I thought I'd figured it out. I thought survival was arithmetic. Calories, elevation, silence, distance, inputs and outputs. I was good at arithmetic. I'd spent my whole career measuring land, calculating slope, establishing boundaries. I thought the apocalypse was a survey problem. It wasn't. But it took me 97 days to understand what it actually was. Let me tell you about the loneliest moment. Not the scariest. I'll get to those. The loneliest. Day 31. I was camped on a ridgeline south of Staunton, in a hunter's blind I'd found nailed into an oak tree about 14 feet up. Good sight lines, good cover. I'd been there 30 hours and was planning to move at dawn. The sky was clear, and the moon was full enough that the valley below me was visible in silver and black. And I could see the town, what was left of it, 4 miles east. No lights, no movement, just geometry. Rooftops and steeples, and the straight line of Main Street cutting through the grid like a scar. I hadn't spoken to another living person in 31 days. I want you to understand what that does. Not the survival part. The survival part is mechanical, and I was adequate at it. I mean what it does to the inside of your head. By day 31, I'd stopped narrating. For the first 3 weeks, I'd talked to myself constantly, describing what I was doing, what I was seeing, giving myself instructions out loud like a parent coaching a child through a dark room. Then it stopped. Not because I decided to stop, because there was no one to be performing for. Language requires an audience, even if the audience is yourself. And by day 31, the self I'd been performing for had packed up and left. I sat in that blind, and I looked at the town, and I thought about Nate Bowling, wondered if he was alive, wondered if Dana was alive, wondered if my mother was alive. And I discovered something ugly. I didn't feel the wondering as concern. I felt it as curiosity. Clinical, detached curiosity, like reading a headline about a country I'd never visited. The emotional wiring that connects other people's suffering to your own chest. Whatever that fiber is. I couldn't find it. I wasn't sure it had ever been connected properly to begin with. Maybe that's why I'd been able to take what was Nate's and drive away. Maybe the wiring was always the problem. That night, I heard a sound from the valley. Not infected. I knew their frequencies by then. This was a human scream. A woman's voice, high and ragged, carrying up the slope on the cold air with absolute clarity. One scream. Then nothing. I stayed in the tree. I didn't climb down. I didn't move toward the sound. I listened to the silence that followed, and I cataloged it the way I cataloged everything. Distance, direction, probable cause, threat assessment. And I went to sleep. I am telling you this because I need you to understand the man who eventually walked back into Marwell. Not the version they carved into the stone, the real one. The one who heard a woman scream from 4 miles away and closed his eyes and slept. Days 32 through 50 were the education. The mountains taught me everything the county assessor's office never did. I learned to read weather by the behavior of crows. I learned which gas stations had been looted and which had been overlooked by checking the condition of the door seals. If the rubber was intact, no one had pried them. I learned that pharmacies were more valuable than grocery stores because antibiotics and painkillers were the new currency even in a world without trading partners. I learned that vehicles were tombs, that highways were arteries pumping the infected from city to city, that the safest ground was the ground no road touched. I learned that I was competent, genuinely, structurally competent at being alone. The skills I'd spent my career exercising, measuring terrain, reading contours, establishing position, turned out to be survival skills of the highest order. I could look at a hillside and know where water was. I could read a tree line and know which side of a ridge the wind would carry sound. I could navigate without GPS, without roads, without landmarks, using nothing but slope and sun angle and the atlas that was becoming as familiar as my own hands. And I learned the most dangerous lesson a solitary person can learn: that I didn't need anyone, that the absence of other people was not a deficit, but a simplification, that every relationship I'd ever had was friction, and friction was what got you killed. The outbreak hadn't taken anything from me. It had confirmed what I'd always suspected, that I was built for departure, and the world had finally arranged itself to match. I believed that completely. For 50 days, I believed it without a crack. Then day 51 happened. I found the first sign of organized survival on day 51, 12 miles northwest of Lexington, at a place I'd been to once as a child. A covered bridge on a county road that crossed a branch of the Maury River. My mother had taken me there to feed ducks when I was 7. I remember the light through the bridge slats and the sound of the water and the feeling of bread in my hand going soft. The bridge was barricaded, not randomly, engineered. Someone had filled both approaches with stacked vehicles, bumper to bumper, then welded steel plates across the gaps. The welding was clean, professional. Behind the vehicle line, I could see a gate made from a cattle panel reinforced with rebar. And beyond that, the road continued into a small valley where I counted 6 structures with intact roofs and 3 columns of chimney smoke rising into the gray morning. A settlement, functioning. At least a dozen people, probably more. I watched from the tree line for 3 hours. I saw 2 men on the bridge with rifles. I saw a woman carrying water in plastic jugs from the river. I saw a child, maybe 8, maybe 10, chasing a dog between 2 of the houses. A child chasing a dog. 51 days into the end of the world, and a child was chasing a dog and laughing. And the sound of that laughter came up the slope to me and hit me somewhere I thought I'd sealed shut. I didn't approach. I didn't signal. I cataloged the position on my atlas with a pencil mark, a small X, and moved on. Over the next 20 days, I found 11 more. 11 settlements, scattered across the Shenandoah and the upper Blue Ridge like seeds blown from different plants, each one distinct. A farm compound near Raffine with solar panels on the barn roof. A fire station in a hollow outside Craigsville where someone had built a greenhouse in the parking bay. A cluster of RVs circled like wagons on a bald ridge above Goshen Pass, connected by clotheslines strung with laundry, actual laundry, drying in the wind like flags of insistent domesticity. Each one barricaded, each one defended, each one alive. I mapped them all, drew their positions, estimated population by chimney count and movement observation. Noted water sources, defensible terrain, probable supply lines. I did it automatically, with the same clinical satisfaction I'd felt surveying property boundaries for the county. Measurement, assessment, documentation. I never introduced myself to any of them. I told myself it was operational security, that making contact meant revealing my position, sharing my routes, accepting the liability of other people's decisions. All of that was true. But it wasn't the reason. The reason was simpler and uglier. I watched those settlements the way I'd watched Marwell from behind my own behavior for years. From the outside, documenting without participating, recording without belonging. The outbreak hadn't turned me into a loner. It had given the loner a landscape that finally fit. Day 63. I was refilling water bottles from a spring I'd identified on the atlas. a blue dot beside a contour line at 2,400 feet, when I heard movement below me on the slope. I dropped flat, pulled the pack under my chest, waited. 2 men came up the trail, living, breathing, armed. One with a shotgun, one with a compound bow. They were talking quietly and moving with purpose, not panic. They stopped at the spring, filled their own containers, and sat on a rock to rest. I was 20 feet away behind a fallen hemlock, close enough to hear them clearly. The one with the bow was named Carter. I know that because the other man said, "Carter, you hear about the Marwell group?" And the world stopped. "Heard they're up to 40, Carter said. "Nate Bowling's running supply coordination. Got the old elementary school set up as a clinic. Dana's handling triage." The other man whistled low. Nate Bowling. Always figured he'd be the type to hold things together. "Yeah." Carter took a drink. Shame about his friend, though. The surveyor. Brosk, I think. His mom says he was in Roanoke when it went. Never came home. They put a stone up for him last month. They refilled their bottles. They talked about a deer trail. They left. I lay behind the hemlock for a long time after they were gone. My name in a stranger's mouth. My death in a casual sentence between sips of water. A stone. They'd put up a stone. I tried to keep moving. That was the protocol. Information gathered, position marked, trajectory maintained. But the protocol was written for a man whose past was abstract. And what Carter had said made it concrete. Nate was alive. Dana was alive. My mother was alive. Marwell had a settlement, 40 people, a clinic in the elementary school where I'd learned to read. And they thought I was dead. I need to explain what that knowledge did to me, because it wasn't grief, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't guilt, though all 3 were in the mixture. It was something I don't have a clean word for. The closest I can get is this. Imagine discovering that a room you trashed was repaired in your absence, and the repair is better than the original, and the people who fixed it did so partly because you weren't there to break it again. That's what I felt. Not sorrow that they'd mourned me. Recognition that my absence was structural. Load-bearing. They'd built something on top of the hole I left, and the hole was holding weight. Nate was running supply coordination. Nate, who I'd betrayed as completely as one man can betray another, was feeding 40 people. Dana was handling triage. My mother was there, telling strangers I'd died in Roanoke. She'd given them a story. A clean one, probably. Her son, the surveyor, caught in the city when it fell. Tragic, simple. No mention of the $11,000 or the reason he left. I could walk in, announce myself, correct the record. The surveyor isn't dead. Here he is, alive, competent, carrying an atlas full of intelligence about every settlement within 60 miles. I could contribute. I could be useful. I could give them what I'd spent 63 days gathering, a map of the surviving world. I kept walking. Away. Northwest along the ridge, putting miles between myself and the gravitational pull of that information. I told myself I needed time to think. But what I was actually doing was the same thing I'd always done. Leaving before the room required me to be honest about why I was in it. Days 64 through 75 were the worst of the 100, not because of the infected. I'd refined my avoidance to a science by then, reading terrain the way a sailor reads current, always upstream of the flow. The worst because the question followed me. It sat behind my eyes during every dawn perimeter walk. It rode in the pack beside the atlas. It was waiting at every spring, in every fire road, and every hunter's blind I climbed into at dusk. Do they need you? Or do they need you to stay dead? I started making arguments. To myself, in the silence that had replaced language. I argued that my atlas was valuable, that the settlement data I'd collected could connect Marwell to the other groups, establish trade routes, create redundancy. I argued that my terrain skills could improve their defensive perimeter, that I could survey their water sources, that I could contribute labor and knowledge, and the 63 days of education the mountains had given me. Every argument was true, and every argument sounded exactly like the justification I'd built for sleeping with Dana. She's unhappy. I can help. This is needed. The logic was always airtight. The logic was always a mask over the thing I actually wanted, which was to be inside the room again, to be seen, to be counted, without paying the cost of honest admission. Day 71. I was on a high bald above the valley, in a wind that smelled like frost, and I could see 40 miles in every direction. The Blue Ridge to the east, fading into haze. The Alleghenies to the west, darker and older. Below me, the patchwork of the valley floor. Brown fields, gray roads, the occasional roof still holding its shape against the sky. Somewhere in that patchwork was Marwell. Somewhere in Marwell was a stone with my name. I opened the atlas, turned to the page with the pencil marks. 11 settlements, 40 to 60 people each estimated, plus Marwell at 40. That was 500 to 700 people surviving in organized groups within a 60-mile radius, connected by terrain I'd walked, mapped on pages I'd marked, visible to a man who'd spent his career reading the land between them. The atlas wasn't mine. That's what I realized on the bald. The data in it wasn't personal. It was public. It belonged to every settlement I'd mapped and refused to enter. Every spring I'd marked was someone else's water. Every route I'd traced was someone else's supply line. I was hoarding a public resource inside a private silence. And the silence was the same one I'd maintained my whole life. The silence of a man who takes without declaring. I turned south, toward Marwell, not because I'd resolved the question, because the atlas had. I moved slowly, not from caution, from cowardice. Every mile south was a mile closer to a conversation I didn't know how to have. What do you say to people who buried you? What do you say to a mother who told strangers you were dead and was probably relieved to have a version of your story that didn't include the real ending? What do you say to the man you destroyed who rebuilt himself into the person the town depends on? Day 78. I was 8 miles north of Marwell, descending through second-growth hardwood along a creek bed I'd waded as a teenager, when I walked into my first serious contact in 78 days of solitude. 3 infected, in the creek, standing in shin-deep water, motionless, facing upstream. I came around a bend, and there they were, 30 feet away, silent, the water moving around their legs like they were rocks. I had never seen them still before. Every encounter had been movement, that dragging, relentless forward lean they all had, like gravity was pulling them from the chest. But these 3 were stationary, waiting. I didn't know what they were waiting for. I froze. Full stop. 1 foot in the water, 1 on the bank. The creek was loud enough to cover my breathing, but not loud enough to cover a retreat through dry leaves. I was boxed. The terrain I'd trusted for 78 days had delivered me into the worst possible geometry. Downstream, low ground, no elevation within reach. The nearest one was a woman, young, wearing a raincoat that had torn at both sleeves. Her hands were in the water, palms down, fingers spread on the creek bottom like she was reading Breus and the stones. The other 2 were behind her, a man in overalls, a man in nothing at all. All 3 faced upstream with the same blank, mechanical patience. I stood there for 11 minutes. I counted them. Each minute was a separate negotiation with my own heartbeat. I could not go forward. I could not go back. I could not climb. The bank was a mud wall topped with laurel, too dense to push through quietly. The Atlas had gotten me into every good position I'd found in 78 days. It had never accounted for this. Then the woman moved. Not toward me. She took one step upstream, then another, then the other two followed. They walked against the current with that terrible leaning gait, water splashing around their shins, moving away from me at the speed of a funeral procession. They were following the water, upstream, toward the source. I waited until they disappeared around the bend. Then I climbed the bank. Laurel thorns opening cuts across my forearms. And I didn't stop moving until I was 500 vertical feet above the creek on a bare sandstone ledge where I could see a mile in every direction, and nothing could approach without crossing open ground. I sat on that ledge until my heart rate came back to something a doctor wouldn't worry about. And I thought about those 3 figures in the creek, and I understood something new. The infected were changing. Not the way the stories said. Not getting smarter, not organizing, not learning to use tools. Something subtler. They were finding patterns. Water patterns, game trails, spring sources. The same patterns I'd been following for 78 days. We were reading the same map. The atlas I was so proud of, the terrain literacy I'd mistaken for superiority. The infected were developing it too, on a slower clock, but with a patience I couldn't match, because they never needed to sleep or eat or argue with themselves about whether they deserved to go home. That meant the settlements I'd mapped were on borrowed time. Every one of them was built near water. Every one of them would eventually find infected at their source, standing still in the current, waiting with their hands on the stones. The atlas wasn't just a gift I owed. It was a warning. I spent days 79 through 84 observing Marwell from the eastern ridge. 6 days. I told myself it was reconnaissance. That I needed to understand the settlement's layout, its routines, its vulnerabilities before approaching. Professional language for unprofessional hesitation. But I learned things I couldn't have learned any other way. The settlement was centered on the elementary school, just as Carter had described. The building's flat roof had been converted into a water collection system. Tarps channeled into gutters, channeled into plastic drums. The playground had been torn up and planted. From the ridge I could see rows, dark lines in pale soil, and figures moving between them with the posture of people who'd learned to garden by necessity rather than interest. The parking lot held 6 vehicles arranged in a semicircle facing outward, doors open, like a drive-in theater showing nothing. Beyond the school, barricades extended north and south along Route 11, constructed from the same methodology I'd seen at the covered bridge settlement. Stacked vehicles, welded steel, cattle panel gates. I counted people, a surveyor's habit, 38 distinct individuals over 6 days of observation. I identified Nate on day 80 by his walk. That long-strided, slightly bow-legged gait he'd had since high school, the one Dana used to imitate at parties while he laughed. He was moving between the school and a house on Maple Street carrying boxes, and I watched him through the scope I'd taken from an abandoned hunting supply store on day 44. He looked thinner. His beard was longer than I'd ever seen it. He moved with a briskness that wasn't urgency. It was purpose. The walk of a man who knows where he's going and why. I saw Dana on day 81. She was on the school steps with a clipboard, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. She'd cut her hair short. She was gesturing with her left hand the way she did when she was explaining something complicated to someone who wasn't keeping up. Even from 800 meters, I could see the competence in her posture. She'd always had that. a physical certainty that made you trust her before she spoke. It was one of the reasons I'd been drawn to her. And I'm trying to be honest in this account. So I will say it was attraction dressed as admiration, and I never bothered to distinguish between the two. I did not see my mother. For 3 days, I scanned every figure that moved through the settlement and could not find her. The house on Birch Street, where I'd grown up, was inside the perimeter, but I couldn't tell from the ridge whether it was occupied. I began constructing explanations. She was inside. She was ill. She was in a part of the settlement I couldn't see from this angle. On day 83, I saw a woman exit the Birch Street house carrying a watering can. She walked to the side yard, where someone had planted tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets, and she bent to water them with the careful, slow attention of a person who has decided that this one task is worth doing correctly, regardless of what the world has decided about itself. It was my mother. I recognized her by the watering, by the posture of her back when she bent, by the specific patience of her hands. She was 68 years old. She had a bad hip. She was watering tomatoes in the apocalypse, alone, in the side yard of the house where she'd raised me. And I was watching her through a rifle scope from a ridge where she couldn't see me. And I was crying for the first time in 97 days. And the tears were not about her. They were about me. About the fact that I was watching my own mother like a specimen, like a target, like a stranger, because that's what I'd made her. Not the outbreak, not the distance. Me. I'd done this on a Tuesday in September when I took her money and left a note and drove away. And the outbreak was just weather laid on top of a ruin I'd already built. I put the scope down, wiped my face, made a decision that wasn't a decision at all, but a surrender to a gravity I'd been fighting for 83 days. I would go in, tomorrow, at dawn. I would walk down the ridge and approach the barricade and say my name and accept whatever came after. I didn't go at dawn. I went at dusk. Not because of tactics, because I spent the entire day sitting on the ridge, rehearsing sentences, and every sentence was wrong. Hi, Mom. I'm alive. Nate, I know you thought I was dead. I wasn't. I was just up the hill. My name is Elliot Brusk. I think you have a grave for me. Nothing worked because nothing could contain both facts simultaneously. That I was alive and that I'd let them believe otherwise for 3 months. The first was good news. The second was the same gesture as the first departure, repeated at a scale that made the original look modest. I'd left them once with a note on a kitchen counter. I'd left them again by staying silent in the mountains while they carved a stone. The symmetry was so precise it felt authored. I descended at dusk because the light was softer, and because I am, at my core, a man who prefers not to be seen clearly. The eastern approach to the barricade, Ian crossed a field that had been a parking lot for the Baptist church. The church itself was intact but dark. The field was open, 100 meters of cracked asphalt with no cover. I walked across it in the last amber light with my hands visible and the pack on my back, and the atlas under my left arm like a schoolboy carrying a textbook to class. The sentry saw me at 50 meters. I heard the shout before I saw the face. Contact east. Single. Walking. A second voice answered from the barricade. Then a third. A light hit me. A handheld spot powered by something I couldn't identify. And I stopped in the middle of the parking lot with my hands up and the atlas still tucked under my arm and squinted into the white glare. I'm unarmed, I said. My voice sounded foreign, rough, the vocal cords of a man who hadn't used them for conversation in 84 days. My name is Elliot Brusk. I grew up here. Silence. The light didn't move. I stood in it and waited. Then a voice from behind the barricade. A woman I didn't recognize. "Elliot Brusk is dead." "No," I said. "He isn't." More silence. Then movement. Figures on the barricade, shifting, conferring. I heard my name passed backward through the settlement like a signal moving through wire. "Elliot Brusk. Elliot Brusk." Someone saying it with a question mark. Someone else with an exclamation. The name traveling through a community that had used it in eulogy and was now hearing it in present tense and didn't know which grammar to apply. 3 minutes. Then the gate opened. Not wide, the gap the width of a single body. And in that gap stood Nate Bowling. He looked at me across 50 meters of broken asphalt in the last of the daylight. I could see his face in the spill from the handheld spot. The beard, the weight he'd lost, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He was holding a bolt-action rifle at his side, barrel down, and his other hand was on the gate frame like he was deciding whether to open it further or close it. "Elliot." He said it flat. Not a question, not a greeting, just a word, confirmation of a fact he was still processing. "Nate." Same tone from me. "I have something you need." I held up the atlas. 11 settlements mapped within 60 miles. Water sources, routes, defensive assessments, and a warning about infected behavior at water sources that your people need to hear before spring runoff. He looked at the atlas. He looked at me. He stepped aside. The gate opened wider. I walked through it into the town I'd fled, carrying a book of maps as my admission ticket, knowing that the data was real and the offering was genuine, and the motive underneath was the same selfish engine that had driven every generous-looking gesture I'd ever made. The need to be allowed back in the room. The gate closed behind me. 20 faces in the half-dark, 20 people looking at a dead man. They put me in the Baptist church, not as punishment, as quarantine. Standard protocol, Nate explained in a voice that was all procedure and no warmth. Any newcomer spent 72 hours in observation before integration. He said it looking at a point slightly to the left of my face, the way you talk to someone you've decided to treat as a category rather than a person. The church was cold, October in the Shenandoah, and the building had no heat source. They gave me a sleeping bag, a jug of water, a can of peaches, and a plastic bucket. They took the atlas. Nate took it personally from my hands and flipped through 3 pages standing in the doorway before closing the church door and locking it from outside. I sat in a pew in the dark and listened to the settlement go through the walls. Voices, footsteps, the sound of a generator running somewhere west. A low hum that was somehow the most civilized thing I'd heard in 84 days. The sound of infrastructure, of continuity, of people who had decided that tomorrow was worth powering. No one came for 12 hours. I slept in the pew, woke to gray light through stained glass, and waited. The waiting was not unfamiliar. It was the same waiting I'd done my whole life. Waiting for someone else to decide whether I was allowed to participate. Waiting to be summoned. Waiting for permission to exist in a space that required more of me than presence. At noon, the door opened, and my mother walked in. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Long enough that the light behind her shifted as a cloud moved. She was wearing a flannel shirt I recognized, my father's, green and black check, the one she'd kept in the closet after he died because it still smelled like him, though by now it must have smelled like nothing or like her. She was leaning on a cane. The hip. It had gotten worse. "Mom," I said. She walked to the pew across the aisle from mine, sat down, placed the cane beside her, folded her hands in her lap. She did all of this without speaking, and without looking at me, and the silence was so complete and so deliberate that I understood it was the point. The silence was what she'd come to deliver. Then she said, "I told people you died in Roanoke. I said you were volunteering at a shelter and it was overrun. I told Margaret Firth you were helping people. I told Pastor Davis you'd been coming to church again before it happened." She paused. Her hands were still in her lap. "I spent 3 months building you a life you never lived, so that people would put flowers on your grave." I couldn't speak. "And now you're here, in the church, alive, with a book of maps." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were dry. Dry the way a riverbed is dry. Not from absence of water, but from the water having gone somewhere else a long time ago. "The maps are useful. Nate says they might be the most valuable thing anyone's brought in. You were always good at measuring things." She stood up, picked up the cane. "You stole $11,000 from me, Elliot. You left a note on the counter like you were canceling a subscription. You let me grieve you for 3 months when you were alive on a hill 8 miles away." She walked to the door. "The maps are useful. You are a problem. Both things are true, and I need time to figure out which one matters more." She left. The door closed. The lock turned. I sat in that pew, and I understood that the grave wasn't a mistake. It was a correction. My mother had looked at the available versions of her son, the one who stole and ran and slept with his best friend's wife and disappeared, and the one who died helping strangers in Roanoke. And she had chosen the better one and buried it with limestone and wildflowers, and carved its name with love. The dead Elliot was her gift to herself, and I had just taken it away from her by being alive. The 72-hour quarantine ended on day 87. Nate came to the church with a woman named Patricia Voss. She was, I learned, the settlement's closest thing to a council chair, a retired county clerk who'd been in Marwell visiting her sister when the collapse hit and had applied her bureaucratic temperament to the problem of organizing survival. She had a clipboard. She asked me 34 questions: medical history, skills, route of arrival, infected encounters, exposure events. I answered each one with the precision of a man taking a professional exam, because that's what it was. A competency assessment disguised as a health screening, conducted by a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing a settlement admits is not a pathogen, but a personality. She asked about the atlas last. I described each settlement, estimated populations, water sources, defensive methodologies, the covered bridge, the farm with solar panels, the fire station greenhouse, the RVs on the ridge. I described the infected in the creek, their stillness, their orientation to the current, the implication for every water-dependent position. Patricia wrote without looking up. When I finished, she said, "You watched 11 settlements for over 3 weeks and never made contact with any of them." "That's correct." "Why?" The honest answer was complicated and unflattering, and I gave it anyway because my mother's visit had stripped whatever protective coating I'd been maintaining. Because I preferred watching to participating. Because approaching meant introducing myself and explaining why I was alone. Because I'm better at measuring things than being part of them. Patricia looked at me over her clipboard. "Nate Bowling wants you integrated as a terrain specialist. Dana Bowling wants you kept at arm's length from any leadership role. Your mother wants you to have a place to sleep that isn't a church. I want to know one thing. Are you going to stay?" The question landed with surgical force. I'd been thinking about the atlas, the settlements, the infected migration patterns, the tactical value I could add. all the external architecture of usefulness. Patricia had walked straight past all of it to the load-bearing question underneath. Was I going to stay? Was the man who left once, then left again by staying silent, capable of remaining inside a system he couldn't control? I don't know, I said. She wrote something on the clipboard. Honest answer. Wrong one, but honest. She stood. You'll bunk in the school annex. You'll work the garden rotation like everyone else. Your terrain data is being copied by hand onto our master map by Nate's team. You will not participate in any council discussion until your residency period clears. 30 days. 30 days. Nate suggested 60. Dana suggested permanent exclusion. Your mother suggested 10. I averaged the inputs and added professional judgment. She tucked the clipboard under her arm. Welcome to Marwell, Mr. Brosk, for however long that turns out to mean. I moved into the school annex that afternoon. A cot in a room that had been a third-grade classroom. The alphabet was still on the wall. Construction paper turkeys from a November project were pinned to a corkboard, their feathers curling. I put my pack under the cot. I had nothing else. That evening, for the first time in 87 days, I ate a meal I didn't prepare. A woman named June brought a plate to the annex. Beans, cornbread, a piece of canned ham. She didn't introduce herself beyond her name. She said, "Kitchen sends this," and left. The food was warm. The cornbread was dense and sweet and tasted like being 9 years old. I ate it alone at a desk built for a child, my knees against the underside, and the act of receiving food from a stranger's hands was so disorienting that I had to set the fork down twice because my hands were shaking. I was inside the room. After 87 days, I was inside the room. And the room hadn't asked me to be honest about why I wanted in. Day 90. I'd been integrated for 3 days. Garden rotation in the morning. Pulling weeds between rows of late squash, working beside people who knew my name from the gravestone and treated me with the specific, careful distance reserved for someone whose category hasn't been established yet. Not hostile, not warm, observational. I was being watched the way I'd watched the settlement from the ridge, and the symmetry was pedagogical. In the afternoon, Nate summoned me to the map room. This was a former teacher's lounge in the school's east wing, where the walls were covered in hand-drawn maps compiled from my atlas and from the Scouts' own reconnaissance. My data was already up, pencil lines on butcher paper showing the 11 settlements, water sources marked in blue pen, estimated populations in small, neat numbers that I recognized as Nate's handwriting. He'd always had precise handwriting, architectural, the kind of penmanship that made you trust the content. 2 other people were in the room. A man named Douglas Prater, mid-50s, former UPS driver who'd become the settlement's primary scout by virtue of knowing every back road in the county. And a young woman named Inez Gallardo, 23, who'd arrived in Marwell on day 40 from a collapsed apartment complex in Staunton, and had turned out to possess an extraordinary memory for numbers and distances. She was the one transcribing my atlas data. She'd been correcting my estimates. Your creek observation, Nate said without preamble. He pointed to a section of the map where I'd marked the 3 infected in the water. You said they were stationary, facing upstream, hands on the creek bed. Yes. Doug saw the same thing 4 days ago. Cedar Creek, west of the Raffine farm. He looked at Douglas, who nodded. 6 of them, standing in the shallows where the creek bends. Not moving, not feeding, just standing. How long? I asked. Doug watched for 90 minutes before pulling back. They didn't move the whole time. Inez spoke. I mapped every water source within our operational radius. 14 springs, 9 creeks, 2 rivers accessible from maintained trails. If the pattern holds, we have to assume they'll be present at all of them by snowmelt. The room was quiet. The map on the wall was a portrait of abundance. Water everywhere. The Shenandoah Valley's geological gift. The reason settlements had clustered here. The reason survival was possible at all. And the pattern I'd observed was a portrait of that abundance being occupied by something that didn't need it for drinking, but was drawn to it by an instinct no one could explain. The settlements I mapped, I said. Every one of them is built within a quarter-mile of a primary water source. That's not optional. You can't sustain a group without proximate water. But if the infected are migrating to those same sources and holding position there, then the settlements aren't near water. They're near infected staging areas. Nate was looking at the map, not at me. He hadn't looked directly at me since the gate. Every interaction was conducted at an angle. Professional, efficient, deliberately stripped of the personal history that made the room vibrate with frequencies only he and I could hear. "You want to run the survey?" he said. "I want to visit each settlement in person. Deliver the warning. Offer route alternatives. Identify secondary water sources that aren't creek-dependent wells, cisterns, roof collection. The atlas has the topography. I can calculate watershed geometry for each position. That's a 6-week circuit through open terrain." "Yes." He finally looked at me. Direct. Measuring. The look of a man deciding whether the tool in front of him is worth the risk of picking it up, given what it did last time. "You'd go alone." "That's how I travel. That's how you do everything." He said it without anger, without accusation, with the flat diagnostic tone of a man who'd spent 6 months studying the wreckage I'd left and had assembled a complete structural analysis. "You leave, Elliot. That's your move. You leave, and you call it a mission." The room was silent. Inez studied the map. Douglas studied the floor. I stood there and received the most accurate sentence anyone had ever spoken about me, and I could not argue because he was right. Every departure I'd ever made was dressed in purpose. I left Marwell to find myself. I left Dana to protect her marriage. I left the mountains to deliver the atlas. The vocabulary changed. The direction didn't. "I'll come back," I said. "You said that to your mother with a note on the counter." Nate approved the survey circuit on day 91. Not because he trusted me. Because the data demanded it. Patricia Voss cast the deciding vote in a council session I wasn't allowed to attend. And the terms were non-negotiable. I would carry copies of the Marwell master map to each settlement, deliver the water source warning, collect updated population and resource data, and return within 42 days. I would carry a handheld radio tuned to Marwell's frequency and check in every 72 hours. If I missed 2 consecutive check-ins, they'd assume I was dead. Again. "This time, it might be true," I said. Nobody laughed. I spent days 92 and 93 preparing. Douglas Prater walked me through his route knowledge, correcting 3 of my atlas paths that had been washed out by fall storms. Inez Gallardo gave me a hand-drawn data collection sheet. Standardized fields for each settlement. Population count methodology. Resource inventory format. She'd designed it with the same meticulous precision I recognized from my own survey work. And when I told her it was excellent, she said, "I copied your atlas format and fixed the parts that were disorganized." And I experienced the unusual sensation of being improved upon by someone half my age, with twice my organizational capacity. On the morning of day 93, my mother came to the school annex. She sat on the cot across from mine. It was unoccupied, its previous resident having moved to a house on Elm Street. and she placed a small package on the mattress between us, wrapped in a dish towel. I opened it. A compass, brass, old, my father's. "He'd want you to have it on the road," she said. "He wouldn't want you to go at all. But since you're going, he'd want you to be able to find your way back." "Mom, I'm coming back." "You're always coming back, Elliot. That's what you say every time you leave. You don't lie about it. You believe it when you say it. You just don't do it." She put her hand on my knee. Once, a brief. Then she stood and walked out. The compass was warm from her pocket. Day 94, departure morning. I was at the gate at dawn with the pack, the atlas, the radio, the compass, and 42 days of the most purposeful solitude I'd ever been assigned. The gate was open. Douglas was there to see me off. Inez was there with a final version of the data sheets. Patricia was there with a document that identified me as an envoy of the Marwell settlement, signed by 3 council members, sealed with a circle of candle wax. Nate was not there. I walked through the gate. I felt the familiar lightness, the expansion of self that comes with leaving, the gravitational release, the sweet narcotic of departure that had been my drug of choice for 36 years. The road opened ahead of me. The mountains waited. The atlas was full of X marks I'd made as a ghost and would now visit as a person. The work was real. The mission was genuine. The lightness in my chest was the same lightness I'd felt driving out of Marwell 6 months ago with 11,000 stolen dollars. I stopped. Middle of the road. Gravel under my boots. Mountains ahead, settlement behind, gate still open. The lightness was the tell. It was always the tell. I'd spent my entire life mistaking relief for purpose. Departure felt like freedom because it was release from accountability. And I'd built an identity around the sensation the way an addict builds a life around the first hit. I was good at leaving. I was practiced at it. I had a professional vocabulary for it now. Survey circuit, terrain assessment, settlement liaison. The words were different. The direction was the same. I turned around, walked back through the gate, found Nate in the map room, alone, studying the water source overlay. "Send Douglas," I said, "or Inez, or both. They're better suited. Douglas knows the roads. Inez knows the data methodology. Send them." Nate looked at me. First direct, sustained eye contact since my arrival. "And you?" "I stay. I work the garden. I dig a well. I fix whatever needs fixing. I stay, and I do the thing I've never done, which is remain in a room after the justification for leaving becomes available." The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then Nate said, "The western barricade needs reinforcement. Steel plate welding. You know how to weld?" "No." "Douglas can teach you before he leaves." He turned back to the map. I stood in the doorway of the room, in the building where I'd learned to read, in the town where I'd learned to leave, and I experienced something I have no confident language for. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not homecoming. Something smaller and more structural. The sensation of a load being accepted. A beam settling into a joint. The architectural moment when a component stops being transported and starts being weight-bearing. I stayed. Days 95 and 96 I welded. Douglas Prater spent 4 hours teaching me the basics before departing on the survey circuit with Inez, a patient, unhurried tutorial in a skill set I had no aptitude for, conducted by a man who'd driven a UPS truck for 22 years and learned to weld from YouTube videos 3 months into the apocalypse. My beads were ugly, globular. Douglas said they'd hold and that aesthetics were a luxury the barricade didn't require. I worked the western perimeter from dawn to midday, then shifted to garden rotation in the afternoon. The rhythm was unfamiliar. Not because the labor was new, but because it was repetitive without being solitary. The garden crew rotated 8 people through 4-hour shifts, and the work required coordination. Who pulled, who composted, who hauled water from the collection drums, who checked the rabbit wire for breach. I had to talk to people. Not about the atlas or the settlements or the infected in the creek. About spacing between squash rows, about whether the compost pile needed turning, about whose turn it was to haul the drums. I was terrible at it. Not at the gardening, at the talking. My sentences came out over-formal, as if I were dictating a survey report. I used words like perimeter when I meant fence, and hydration logistics when I meant who's carrying the water today. The garden crew, June, who'd brought my first meal, a man named Tomas Reyes, who'd been a high school custodian, a teenager named Waverly, whose last name I never learned, treated my vocabulary with a gentle tolerance reserved for someone who was clearly trying and clearly failing. Waverly was the one who cracked it. Day 96, afternoon. I was explaining that the soil moisture gradient indicated a subsurface drainage pattern that might benefit from a redirection of the downspout catchment. And Waverly, who was 16 and had been surviving the apocalypse since she was 15, looked at me and said, "You mean the dirt's wet because the gutter's leaking?" "Yes." "Then just say that." I stood there with dirt on my knees and a trowel in my hand, and I heard, under her correction, the echo of every relationship I'd ever sabotaged with language. I spoke in measurements because measurements don't require vulnerability. I spoke in technical terms because technical terms don't carry emotion. I'd built a vocabulary as a surveyor builds a transit. Elevated, precise, designed to observe without being observed. And a 16-year-old girl with muddy hands and no patience for my architecture had walked straight through it. "The gutter's leaking," I said. "I'll get a bucket," she said. And that was the conversation. 12 words total. The most honest exchange I'd had in years. On the evening of day 96, Dana Bowling found me at the western barricade. I was finishing a weld. A bad one, a lumpy seam where 2 steel plates met at the gate frame. And I didn't hear her approach until she was standing behind me in the orange light of the last quarter hour. "Elliot." I lifted the mask. She was standing with her arms crossed, the clipboard she carried everywhere tucked against her ribs. Her face was the same face and completely different. The same bone structure, the same directness in the eyes, but carried differently, like a house that had been reframed from inside. Same exterior, new load path. "Dana, I voted against your integration. I want you to know that. I voted to send you back into the mountains with a week's supplies and instructions not to return." "I know. Patricia told me the votes. I wasn't being cruel. I was being structural. You damaged things by being inside them. You damaged Nate. You damaged me. You damaged your mother. Not through violence or malice. Through the specific gravity of being near a person who was always preparing to leave. That gravity deforms everything around it. People lean toward the door you haven't walked through yet. It distorts the room." I set the welding mask on the barricade ledge. "I know." "Do you?" "Because knowing is your specialty. You know everything. You measure everything. You map everything. And you use all of that knowing as a substitute for the one thing you've never done, which has remained still long enough for someone to trust the floor beneath you." She uncrossed her arms. "Nate won't say this because Nate has decided to treat you as a resource, and I understand why. But I owe you nothing professional, so I'll say it. If you leave again, don't come back. Not because we won't take you. Because each return makes the gravity worse." She walked away toward the school. I stood at the barricade with a cooling weld and the smell of flux in my nostrils, and received the most precise structural assessment of my character that anyone had ever delivered. And I deserved every word of it, and it changed nothing about who I'd been, and everything about who I was required to become. Day 97. The grave. I'd been avoiding it. 3 days inside the settlement, and I hadn't walked to the cemetery, hadn't crossed the churchyard, hadn't looked at the stone that bore my name and a death. I didn't die, and a story my mother had written in place of the real one. But the atlas was gone. Douglas and Inez were carrying it west. The welding was caught up. The garden had no afternoon shifts scheduled. And the cemetery was 200 yards from the school, visible from the annex window. The same cemetery where my father's actual body lay in actual ground beneath an actual stone that bore a date that wasn't invented. I walked there at midday, alone. Through the churchyard gate, past the rows I'd known since childhood, Hendersons and Kaplans and Worths. The sedimentary layers of a small town's mortality. To the back row where newer stones stood in thinner grass. My father's marker was where it had always been. Gray granite. Harold Brosk, 1949 to 2018. Beloved husband and father. I hadn't been at the funeral. I'd been in Richmond for a training certification, and I'd chosen not to drive back. 3 hours. I could have made it. I chose the certification. That's who I was. 3 stones to the right. Limestone. Smaller. Freshly set. The dirt around it still mounded. The carving was deep and clean. Someone with real skill had done this. Someone who knew how to work stone with hand tools. Elliot James Brosk, 1989 to 2025. He measured the land and loved it. His mother loved him more. I read it 7 times. Each reading was a different knife. The first line was my name, and I had no quarrel with it. The second line was a lie. Not the birth year, but the death year. The specific fictional date that allowed this stone to exist, and the story attached to it to function. The third line was my mother's version of me, the surveyor who loved the land. It was true, and it was incomplete, and it was chosen, curated, the way a eulogy always is. Not false, but selective, presenting the measurements without the measurer, the skill without the man who used it to maintain distance from everything the skill was measuring. The fourth line broke me. His mother loved him more. Not past tense, not conditional, present and permanent, and absolute. Carved into stone by a woman who knew exactly who I was and loved me anyway and had every reason not to. And the carving was her final editorial act. The one line she allowed herself that wasn't narrative or protective or invented. The one true thing on the stone. I knelt in the grass. The ground was cold. November was coming, and the mountains were already wearing their first frost in the mornings, and the air smelled like wood smoke from the settlement's chimneys, and I knelt beside my own grave. And I pressed my hands flat on the limestone, and I felt the carved letters under my fingertips. The B of Brosk, the curve of the S, the deep straight cuts of the M and more. And I'd understood what I was touching. I was touching the shape of what my absence made possible. The clean story, the grievable son, the measurable loss. My mother had carved a man who loved the land because she needed me to have loved something. And she chose the thing she'd actually seen me love, the only thing I'd been honest about. And she put it on stone because stone was the medium for things that were supposed to be finished. I wasn't finished. That was the problem. I was alive and present and kneeling beside a monument to a version of myself that was better than the breathing one. And the question I'd carried since day 63. Do they need you, or do they need you to stay dead? Resolved itself not into an answer, but into a task. Not to become the man on the stone. He didn't exist. But to stop being the man who made the stone necessary. I stood up. I didn't remove the flowers. I didn't correct the date. I left the stone as it was. Accurate in the ways that mattered. Fictional in the ways that had been required. My mother's best work and my worst mirror. I walked back to the settlement. I found Thomas in the garden and asked what needed doing. He said the rabbit wire on the north beds had a gap. I got pliers and a roll of wire from the supply room, and I spent the rest of the afternoon on my hands and knees patching a fence. And the fence was small and the work was ordinary, and I stayed. The grave is still there. I pass it every morning on the way to the western barricade, where I weld steel plates with beads that are slowly getting less ugly. I pass it every afternoon on the way to the garden, where Waverly still corrects my vocabulary, and I still say drainage gradient when I mean puddle. I pass it every evening on the way to my mother's house, where I sit on the porch with her while she talks about the tomatoes or doesn't talk at all. And both are fine. And I'm learning that presence without performance is a skill that takes longer to acquire than any survey technique I ever mastered. Nate and I are not friends. We may never be. But he trusts my data, and I trust his coordination, and there is a version of respect that lives below friendship, in the infrastructure layer. And I have decided to stop demanding access to the floors I burned. Douglas and Inez returned on day 114, with contact confirmed at 9 of the 11 settlements. 2 had relocated. The water source warning reached everyone. The map is growing. I measured land my whole life and never understood what I was measuring. Not boundaries, not contours, not distances. I was measuring the space between myself and everything I was afraid to remain near. The grave caught me because it was the first measurement I couldn't take from a distance. I had to kneel. I had to touch the stone. I had to read my mother's love in limestone with my own hands. Day 100 was a Tuesday. I patched a fence. I welded a gate. I ate cornbread in a room with other people. I stayed.